Maximum wheat is what they asked me to speak about, and it's a real pleasure, by the way, to be invited here by Farming Smarter and Ken and Jamie and the whole crew. And I was really impressed yesterday with the level of data. I'm a data guy, right? If you don't tell me it works if you can't put numbers behind it. So if I tell you something works and I don't have the numbers, just call me out. Say, Johnson, that's crap. That just isn't right. But yesterday was very, very cool, and so that's exactly where I want to be. Just so you know, if you don't like what I say, or even if you do like what I say, I really don't care. But if you want to get a hold of me, my dad is up there. It's peter.johnson@bell.net. My cell phone number's there. I'm at Wheat Pete, as Sean said. I love Twitter. Twitter is an incredible agricultural tool. I think Facebook stinks. I'm not much on Instagram, but by golly, if you're not on Twitter, then you're out of the game. And by the way, if your agronomist is not on Twitter, get a new agronomist. I like it. I like it. Okay, so what I want you to do, because this frustrates me, right? I'm a Canadian, I'm a proud Canadian, and the Yanks are tweeting more than we are. Now, surely to goodness we can change that. So make sure you keep your ringers off, but all day today I challenge you to make sure that you're tweeting. The hashtag, as was said yesterday, is hashtag FSC. That's, Farming Smarter Conference. That takes rocket science. 15, and let's see if we can't just really put this thing on the map. I think it's really quite cool. As Sean said, I do work with Real Agriculture. That has been a real pleasure. The one thing, I don't think Sean's such a really smart guy necessarily, but by God, he's good at putting smart people around him. And it has been such a pleasure to work with Real Ag, and the expertise that they bring to the table is unbelievable. Rhett, who kind of makes me look good on Wheat Pete's word, is just a gem of a guy, has tremendous skills. And what's intriguing, if you've never gone there, go to the website, Real Agriculture, and just listen to one for fun. Because what Sean and I are kind of playing with now is, would this be a fit for Western Canada? And so I think Sean and I would like a little bit of feedback if this might have some play here. And if you like the format or you don't like the format, you can leave a question. And by the way, I'm getting questions from Manitoba. I'm getting questions. I actually get questions from Australia once in a while. It's kind of a cool process. But it's just something to have a little bit of fun with. All right, enough shameless plug. So I want to start here because this particular slide, really says a lot about life and about people in general. And so, people in general, the picture on the right, on your right, is a pretty nice carrot, but it's sort of all show and no go, right? It's all and in life, agronomists are like that. And, in this room, who would be the guy that's all show and no go? Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's Ken Coles. Thank you very much. George Loverts. I don't know who George Loverts is, so I can't really comment. But and the other side of the coin, of course, are people that are all go and no show, right? And in this room, who would that be? Oh, come on, it's got to be me. Who the heck else, right? Absolutely. So just a little bit of fun. So high wheat yields. We want to talk about maximum wheat, and I really do, I want to push you there because I think you can get there. And what really frustrates me the most is that wheat is the most responsive crop we grow to management. And yet it's the crop that we manage the least. Across the world, it's just kind of a rotation crop. In my part of the world, they don't care about it. And it doesn't matter where I go. I went to Australia, so they manage other crops. Like wheat, you just put it in the ground, you expect a good yield, and if it doesn't do that, you're mad at it. But it really responds to management. So where are the highest wheat yields in the world coming from? New Zealand? Sorry? Yeah, Britain. So actually the two spots are New Zealand and the UK, the British Isles. And why is that? Climate. What about the climate? 11 months growing season. Yeah, we default to this 11-month growing season, but you're just making excuses. You're really just making excuses. Latitude, a little bit, it's their maritime. They're surrounded by water. And so the temperatures stay cool. And that's really where they gain the most, right? It makes it a little tough in Alberta to think we can grow high-yield wheat, because I don't quite think you're surrounded by water, but yeah, frozen, yeah, anyway. It is, so if you're going to go there, if we want to grow maximum wheat, we really have to look at what do those guys do, and what drives them, and what of those things apply in Alberta or in Ontario. So when I was the provincial specialist and I was hitting this wall and we couldn't get wheat yields higher, we went to the UK and we brought in one of their experts to tell us, what they did that we weren't doing, and we learned quite a bit. So the highest wheat yields in the world previously was Mike Solari out of New Zealand. That's the field that he grew it in, and it was 233 bushels per acre. He set that record in 2010. That record was broken this year, and it was in Lincolnshire in the UK, and that particular record was 16.5 tons per hectare. I don't quite understand tons per hectare yet. I'm sort of bilingual in that respect, but not quite. So if you don't like that, it's 246 bushels per acre. And at the table this morning, I think it was Troy actually who was saying that in that field, or someone at the table said that there was a 5-acre chunk in that 29-acre field where the yield monitor was saying 330 bushels per acre. Well, maybe the yield monitor wasn't calibrated, who knows. But nonetheless, that's pretty good wheat, right? It's really pretty good wheat. So kind of cool that we can get those yield levels. How do we get there? So here's what I always hear when I come to Alberta, or if I come to Saskatchewan, I come west. You guys are like farmers everywhere, but mostly in my part of the world, we just whine about the weather in general. Out here, it's all about the water, right? We didn't get enough water, so we didn't get enough wheat. Yeah, I don't buy that. So let's just look quickly at where they grew the record wheat crops this year. And believe it or not, at 246 bushels per acre, they believe that they lost yield because of dry conditions. And you're laughing, but I believe them. Because how wet is the UK climate? Pretty wet, right? Everybody thinks it's a really wet climate. Is the UK wetter or is Ontario wetter? Yeah, Ontario is a lot wetter than the UK. The UK on average gets 2 inches of rain per month. It's not nearly as wet as what a lot of people think. And so when you look at where they got the highest yields, where they broke the yield, and so it's the northernmost circle there, you can see that they, in June, got 50% of normal rainfall. So they got an inch of rain basically in June. And they still got 246 bushels per acre. Now it does need water. I don't argue with that. But boy, it does not need as much water to get high yields as what a lot of people think. And everybody thinks Ontario is blessed with water. We are. We actually have too much. And it works against us from that standpoint. So don't whine as much about water as you want to. This is a key statement. If you don't manage or try for high yields, you will never achieve for the high yields. It just won't happen. So right out the gate, you have to say, I'm going to grow 150 bushel per acre wheat or 240 bushel per acre wheat. And if you go to the field, and again, at the breakfast table this morning, well, the one comment was made, if you fertilize for a drought, you will get a drought. And it's absolutely true. So you have to get through this mindset that we are going to manage the wheat crop like it's a real crop. We are going to manage that crop like it's going to give us 200 bushels, and once in a while we'll get there. Not all the time, but once in a while. So from that standpoint, I want you to look around the table that you are sitting at, because there's been studies done, and it's quite intriguing, that your level of success will equal slightly less than the average, so you're never going to quite make average, of the 10 people closest to you. So look to your left and look to your right, and by God, if they aren't the best farmers in the room, get up and move. So we want to get here. We absolutely want to get here. We want it. This happens to be a nice picture. That wheat field, right where that guy's running, is averaging 146 bushels per acre in Ontario. The field average was 141. That's the highest we've ever managed to get in Ontario, but that is sweet-looking wheat, right? So that is sort of where we'd like to go. How do we get there? And so I go back to the UK and say, well, what in the UK happened? And they started this process way back before we started. And they started back in the late 60s. And what did they do? Well, first they got effective herbicides. And let me tell you, I'm not going to talk about weed control, but I think you all know you can't grow weeds and wheat, or lentils and wheat, or canola. You got to have good weed control. That goes without saying. But they also got semi-dwarf varieties. And I'll make a comment in a minute, but trust me, like, varieties are incredibly critical. So semi-dwarf just meant they stood better, but variety improvement is part of the key that makes this whole thing work. You cannot get maximum wheat without the right genetics. They also got better fungicides, effective fungicides, which really allowed them to increase their nitrogen. And this is the biggest key, that fungicide-nitrogen interaction. But they doubled their yields from 60 bushels per acre to 120 bushels per acre in about 20 years just by doing those things. And that's incredible. So I want to get there. So let's talk quickly about varieties. And was a really good study done by Rob Graff, and I forget who else authored that study, about genetic improvement in Western Canada. And a couple or 3 years ago, I was at the Farm Tech Conference, and I made the comment that Western Canadian wheat varieties suck. And man, oh man, did I have a lot of wheat breeders mad at me. Because they thought I was shooting at them. I was not shooting at them at all. I think you should worship the ground that Ron DePaul walks on, because I think Western Canadian wheat breeders did an amazing job. It's just that, as the first speaker talked about quality, they had to breed in handcuffs because of the quality parameters that they had to fit. And when you focus that much on quality, you can't focus as much as you would like to on yield. So everything I'm going to talk to you about today, we did in Ontario in 1988. We called it intensive cereal management. We looked at the UK, we followed the UK recipe, and it was an unmitigated disaster. It did not work. And it did not work because we didn't have the genetics to use the inputs that we were applying. We didn't have the yield potential. And what's really intriguing is that if you look at this, and I don't know if I can get this mouse to, the mouse is not moving, but, oh, there we go. What the interesting thing about this genetic improvement, because most of this is genetic improvement, and by the way, all an agronomist ever does is make sure that the inputs are there so that the genetic yield potential that the wheat breeders give us can actually be realized. So my job really is secondary, although you can't get there without me, trust me, somehow I got to convince you I'm worth my money, but it is genetics. So what's intriguing about this is that it looks like a straight line because that's the way we tell the computer program to draw the line, but it's actually a stepwise procedure. So when we got Augusta rather, the wheat variety Augusta, that was this step here. Then we got Harris, we bumped up, we got a new plateau. A little bit of chatter in the data, and then we got 2540, which was the next big step. We got a step here, then we got 2547, and the next big step, and we are desperately waiting for the next step in terms of getting us to that next yield plateau. So whatever you do, whether it's your checkoff or it's somehow, buy certified seed, whatever, you have to support the breeding effort because it's the only way you're ever going to get there. And that message I can't make too strongly. Anyway, we'll carry on. So the other thing, what are we trying to do? We're really trying to harvest the sun. As a farmer, your number one job is to harvest the sun. And any time that you see sunlight hitting bare soil, you are failing at your job. I'm a big cover crop guy. I really hate, wasting any sunlight, but the real job is to harvest the sun. So we look at kind of the equation. This gets a little busy, and I apologize for that, but this is sort of what you have to, the background that you look at. So it really is crop yield potential, and it just looks at the number of factors, the one of which is conversion of sunlight to the biomass of the crop. Boy, I wish we could get better at that. Did you know that we're only at 1% conversion efficiency in wheat? Solar panels are at 10%. I hate solar panels. The whole concept drives me crazy. But anyway, they do a better job than we do. Corn is 2.5% efficient. So when corn gets the right conditions, no wonder it will out-yield wheat. And I struggle with that a lot. But the other thing that's interesting about the corn equation is that the harvest index there, the furthest circle to your right, our harvest index has typically been about 50%. In the corn game, they've actually pushed that harvest index up to 56 or 57%. So all harvest index is the amount of grain to the amount of straw, right? So if I can get 56% grain, and I'm after the grain to the amount of straw, well, now my yield that I get paid for goes up. And what's intriguing in winter wheat in Ontario is that some of the new genetics, we are pushing the harvest index up to 55%. We haven't got there in spring wheat yet. But again, this genetic progress really does make a big deal. Okay, so we want to get here, and it's really about what are the cereal yield components. It's just, there's three things. I'm going to move that off so it's not quite in the way there. Number of heads per square meter, the number of grains per head, and the weight of each grain. Just three things. That's what makes the yield when we're trying to harvest the sun. So how do we utilize all those things and try to come up with this 146 or whatever bushel corn or wheat crop? So here's a really interesting graph, because if we're going to manage better, we have to understand enough about the wheat crop that we can add inputs at the right time when the weather gives us the opportunity. Because yesterday they talked about managing risk, right? And more inputs adds risk because you're at a higher level of cost. If you go out there and you put all the inputs on the day you plant, and then you get a drought, your risk is really high. But if you can watch the weather and understand the weather and start off with a base program and then build on the base program given the weather that you know has already happened, you can really manage that crop for the maximum potential yield every year that you have it. And that's really quite critical in Alberta. I talked at Foremost last June, and they were in the middle of a horrendous drought, and nobody wanted to hear from me because all they were worried about was cutting costs. Don't spend another dollar. And I get that. And when you're in that drought, that's what you have to do. So you look at this graph or this chart, and it's really quite intriguing because you've talked or people have talked to you a fair bit about tiller management. Well, notice that if you get over here to the number of heads per square meter, right? The number of tillers, the number of heads, that doesn't have that great a correlation with high yields. It has a little bit of correlation with high yields, but not nearly as much as you might have expected. So that's kind of interesting. And then if you go over here to grains per head, or if you come down here to 1,000 kernel weight, those are the things that really make a difference in yield. And that's no different than it is with the corn crop, or most all grasses, and even the legumes, it's the grain fill period that is most critical. So up until that point, you can do what you like and you'll have a little bit of impact, but it really is that grain fill period, the number of kernels per head, and the 1,000 kernel weight that makes the biggest difference. So I look at that and I say, well, let's compare. And this is just Ontario and the UK. I didn't put in Alberta because you guys should be able to do that. But I find it amazing that we talk about head count and tiller management, and it is important. We also talk about seeding rates, and I've done whack of seeding rate trials, and at the end of the day, seeding rates aren't that important. You can seed a low seeding rate, and if you get good weather, the wheat will just compensate by tillering more, and you'll end up with the same stinking number of heads per square meter. So when you look at this, and you look at my 3 bullet points, or actually, so pay attention. First off, the UK, I find really intriguing. You know, they're at 450 ears per meter squared. We in Ontario think we need 650. So that's heads per square meter. If you don't like per square meter, divide by 10, you get square feet. There's 10 square feet in a square meter. So if you're an old guy that likes to think about feet, you can do it that way. But they're only about 2/3 as many heads per square meter as what we are in Ontario, yet they yield way more because they get more grains in every head and they get a lot higher 1,000 kernel weight. And when you come down here and you say, okay, how does that play in terms of my management? Well, if I manage and I split my nitrogen, which I believe in split nitrogen, absolutely, but I split my nitrogen to try and manage my tiller count, and I get one more tiller that survives per square foot, that gains me about 35 kernels in that square foot. But if I can manage my fungicides and my nitrogen so that I get one more seed per head, I get 65 kernels per square foot, or if I get 1 gram more per 1,000 kernel weight, 1 gram more per seed rather, it also gives me 65 kernels per head. And by the way, there's 35 seeds, there's about 18 grain sites there, if ever on a head, 18 grain sites. If I could manage that anthesis period better, so I didn't get 35, I didn't get basically 2 seeds at every floret, I could get 3 seeds, and I go from 35 to 48 or to 54 seeds per head. Man, the yield potential is unbelievable. So tiller management, yeah, okay, but really focus in on what you can do once you're close to that anthesis timing. That's really where it hits the most. So a few other quick things, because you talked about the fact that the UK and New Zealand get a longer growing period, and they absolutely do. But it's not quite as impressive as you think, because when you look at the way wheat works, and you can do this at home, once your wheat pollinates, all you have to do is start looking at your temperatures. And it's high temperature plus low temperature divided by 2, and that gives you growing degree days. And most wheats get about 660 growing degree days between anthesis and grain maturity. And so you just add up those things, and then you look at, the potential grain per day that you actually get, the bushels per acre per day. At Lethbridge, we are about 49.7 degrees latitude. So if you look at the latitude there of the UK and New Zealand and Ontario, so your radiation, it would probably mean that you're somewhere in the range of 3.8 bushels per acre per day of wheat that you gain for every day you can lengthen the grain fill period. So you really want to lengthen that grain fill period if you can, because that gives you a fairly big impact on yield. And that's why fungicides work. And that's why fungicides at anthesis work better than fungicides at flag leaf stage, because they lengthen that grain fill that little bit longer. And it's kind of intriguing from that standpoint. The other thing that bugs the heck out of me is if you look at the actual potential yield that we get versus the potential yield that's out there, we're down around 50%. And that really stinks. We could do a lot better from that standpoint. Okay, so the last thing I want to throw at you, and then we're going to get into some real agronomics, is it's all temperature. It's absolutely all temperature. And this is London, Ontario. It doesn't really matter, but a couple things that you really kind of gain from this. One, by the way, what is the ideal temperature for wheat? What is the perfect temperature for wheat? Daytime and nighttime. Anybody? 22? I told you Ken didn't know anything. I heard 25? 15? So an 18-degree day and a 10-degree night is optimum for wheat. And warm nights are far more impact on wheat than warm days. Because if you get a 20-degree night, the wheat respires like crazy and it gives up too much of the photosynthate that it gained through that day. The French say that every day over 25 degrees Celsius, you lose a bushel per acre per day. So this heat thing plays huge, and it plays huge here, it plays huge in Ontario as well. High temperatures kill. And if ever you get a stretch of weather over 35 degrees Celsius, the wheat crop's done. If you get 5 days over 35, you will not have high yields because it's just too hot. It just shuts it down. And again, that really high wheat yield that we got in the UK, they whine because they had one day, July the 1st, in that grain fill period where they got 30 degrees Celsius, and they feel that that also had a negative impact on their wheat yield. One day at 30. And that's pretty minimal. So that's sort of where we're at. The other thing that this chart does show that I think is pretty cool is that, and I'm going to talk about this next, is planting date. And for you guys and for us in Ontario as well, as soon as I can move my planting date earlier, which means I head earlier, if I can head with my wheat crop, and that's why winter wheat will always out-yield spring wheat, it heads out earlier. If I can head out earlier so that I get a bigger portion of that grain fill period during those lower temperatures and less of it up in the hot time frame, I get higher yield. So it's really about trying to maximize that temperature and the sunlight, because you get longer days on the 21st of June than you do on the 21st of September or the 21st of August. If your grain's still filling on the 21st of August, a lot less daylight hours than there is during, early July. So the earlier we can get it to head, the more yield potential we're going to have. So planting date is number one agronomic factor that I think, and you guys all know this, I don't need to tell you this, I'm not going to spend long on it, but this is just some Ontario data, and whatever you can do to plant earlier. I'm a big believer in frost seeding. I know you guys all think I'm nuts and nobody does it, but they do it in Montana, it seems to work. I don't understand why it wouldn't work here, but regardless, they talked about 24-hour-a-day planting. Man, in Ontario, we lose a bushel per acre per day for every day that we delay planting. And so if you've got a lot of acres to plant and you decide that you're going to run one shift and you're going to work 18 hours a day and you end up, planting 3 days later into that season, well, that's 3 bushels per acre that you gave up on however many acres that you planted from that standpoint. When it's fit to go, you go and you go hard. And 24 hours a day is absolutely something. For winters, it's actually more critical on planting date early than late. And I know you're not a big winter wheat area, but if you're in springs, the later it gets, the more critical that is. And why is that? It's because you're into a hotter period. You're gaining more heat. So every day you lose actually is more than a day. So this just kind of proves that point, and you can see in this particular chart that why did we get no yield difference between the 21st of October and the 16th of November? It's because we gained no heat through that period. I talk about growing degree days, we gained no heat. So it didn't matter whether I planted on the 21st or the 16th, and it makes less difference if you plant on the 15th of April or the 20th of April because it's cool then. You're not giving up much heat. But Lord help us, if it's the 15th of May, you gotta go hard. And you should go hard early because then that early planted stuff benefits from every little bit of heat that's out there. The other thing that I've done a rotten job of in Ontario, and I'm really trying to do a better job, pick it up, is look at not only is it planting date, but it's seeding rate by planting date. And so this is one of the things that I don't think many people think about. But if I plant early, and that wheat crop emerges when the temperatures are cool, what happens to my tillering capability? I get way more tillers, right? Because wheat is going through its life cycle more slowly at cool temperatures, and it will tiller more. So I plant early, I reduce my seeding rate. If I can reduce my seeding rate, particularly if I'm buying certified seed, which is not cheap, it's a win-win scenario. I don't give up yield, and you can see, and this is winter wheat data, but I have the same data set for spring wheat. When I planted early on the 17th of September, it didn't matter what seeding rate that I planted. And this, by the way, works in Germany, it works in the UK, it works in Australia. Why doesn't it matter? It's because the plant has lots of time to tiller and it compensates. As soon as I went to the 30th of September, the hatched bars, if you will, I could hardly put enough seed on. And that is only a 13-day difference in planting date. So seeding date by seeding rate. The later you plant, and so this just drives that point home. November the 19th is quite late for us, but when we went to 3 million seeds per acre, and by the way, don't talk to me about pounds per acre. If you're going to, gosh, you guys aren't really corn guys yet, but ask a corn grower when the last time was that they seeded 20 pounds per acre of corn. Because it's all about 30,000 seeds per acre, right? Or 36,000 seeds per acre. And it should be the same thing in wheat. It should be seeds per acre. It's not about pounds per acre. But when we went up to 3 million seeds per acre, and essentially all we're trying to do is build more green area to intercept sun, we gained back all the yield that we lost by the late planting. So really quite intriguing. So this brings us to about here. Of course, it's raining out today, not quite snowing, but yeah, a few rednecks in the crowd. Yeah, absolutely. So what's next? Starter fertilizer. This is one that I think you all do. And if you don't, you have to, right? But phosphorus is incredibly important in wheat. Not so much potash, and yesterday they mentioned that your high potash soils anyway, but your rates, by the way, the rates of phosphorus you're using are, to my way of thinking, too low. You can argue with me about that later. But this is kind of the impact. So that's what we call corn row syndrome in Ontario. That's wheat planted without a starter fertilizer. But the corn, 2 years previously, had a starter fertilizer band put with it in 30-inch rows. And that's how much impact it has. And if you look at it for winter wheat, you're going to grow winter wheat. Again, this is winter wheat where without phosphorus, it did not survive the winter. Still corn row syndrome, huge impact. And when I look at it from a field situation, so this is a particular field in 2014, was a really tough year for us from a winter survival standpoint. The soil test on that field is 38 parts per million. So it's well out of what you would consider the responsive range to phosphorus. There's the field at harvest, and that obviously is a strip that we put in without phosphorus. And what it ends up was a 30 bushel per acre yield increase. Like my guys, my growers, if they run out of phosphorus starter in the air cart, they stop seeding until they put fertilizer back in. Like, it just is that much of a difference. What's really intriguing is that there's sort of some philosophy why that would be. If you look at the requirement, the phosphorus requirement of wheat, it has the highest phosphorus requirement in the early growing stages of any crop that we deal with. And I didn't put canola up there, but canola is quite low as well. Legumes in general have a very low early phosphorus requirement. Grasses have a higher phosphorus requirement, but wheat needs 15 pounds of phosphorus in that first 30 days of growth. And some other interesting things are at the bottom there that I think is kind of cool. Phosphorus is 5 times more available in a warm soil than it is in a cool soil. And I'm push for you to plant early. What are soil temps when you plant early? They're low. So you've got to have that phosphorus there. 20% more root growth as soon as the soil warms up 1 degree. So again, pushes you to put that. And the other thing, and it was quite intriguing when David Montgomery talked yesterday, and he showed you those roots, right? And where they put fertilizer on, there was less roots. Yeah, I call bullshit. So maybe with nitrogen that's true, but if you put a band of phosphorus there, you get more roots, not less roots. Phosphorus causes root proliferation, and it helps that plant pick up more phosphorus, and so you just need to do that. The other thing that's kind of intriguing is in our data set is that we get this yield response regardless of soil test. So my soil test, it's a little bit hard to read, it's a bit small. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see that the different bar colors are different soil tests. So blue bars are low soil test, red bars rather are medium soil test, green bars are what we would call up to very high, almost excessive soil tests, and even at what we would consider like 56 parts per million, we go excessive at 60. I'm still picking up 3 to 4 bushels per acre from starter phosphorus with wheat. It has a huge demand, you just have to do it. The reason that I question your rates is because when Ken was talking yesterday, you were talking about 20 pounds of phosphorus. Man, I want my guys to put on enough phosphorus that they replace what they remove. And a good wheat crop takes off 50 pounds of phosphorus. It depends on the yield. It depends on whether you're taking the straw off as well, but around 50 pounds of phosphorus. So I'm a big, 100 pounds a map is where I'm at because that puts on 52 pounds of phosphorus, and that keeps me on a level playing field in terms of not mining that soil for phosphorus. Okay, so now we're about here. Yeah, that's why guys need forklift licenses, right? So one thing that I have learned in my 30 plus years as an agronomist, and this shouldn't come as a surprise, but it is kind of, I've learned this lesson on my own farm. I farm in my spare time. Holy mackerel, every time I think I can get away without, it rocks my butt. It cost me 20 bushels per acre in corn yield this year. And that is, you never starve the crop for nitrogen. If there's one thing that drives yield more than anything else in grass crops, it's nitrogen. And you got to be a little careful because why do we have a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico? Because down the Mississippi goes a whole lot of nitrogen. So I'm not saying over apply, but don't under apply because it always costs huge. So how do we get there? Some of the things that we've done, this trial, and I'm going to buzz, most of you will have seen this trial before, and so I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but it is my key message when it talks about growing better wheat. This is where we actually get better wheat. So we did these trials. Here's the cooperators that I need to recognize because without these people, we couldn't have done this. But essentially what we did, we looked at the interaction, and this was actually what the UK guys said to me. In 2008, when Jim Orson came to Ontario and talked to the Ontario growers about how they grew wheat, and he looked at me and said, Peter, you've worked for the Ministry of Agriculture and Food for 23 years. Tell me what you've done with research. And I said, well, I've researched a lot on nitrogen. He says, good for you. What'd you find? Well, it's kind of whatever. And he said, what else have you done? I said, I've done a lot of work on fungicides. Oh, good for you. What'd you find? Yeah, they're always break even. Fungicides are just a joke. It's always break even. Why would you use them? And I said seeding rates, whatever. And he said, so Peter, did you ever look at fungicides and nitrogen in combination? And I said, no, for crying out loud. I'm a good researcher. You look at one thing at a time. And he just says, yeah, well, guess what? You stink. because it's the interaction, and that's what they learned in the UK. Fungicides by themselves don't play. What the fungicide does is it keeps the crop alive, it keeps the plant material alive so it can use the added nitrogen that you put on. And it's this nitrogen by fungicide synergy that makes the whole thing work. And it's not 1 + 1 = 2. If nitrogen is 1 and fungicides are 1, 1 + 1 = 2.5 or 2.8 or sometimes 3. And so we started looking at that. We did a whole lot of trials. We did them off station. So by the way, Manitoba, I gave this talk last year in Manitoba, and I actually got some of those guys excited. And John Hurd, who's the soil fertility guy there, said, we're going to do this in Manitoba. And he sent me the data. It's not released yet, so I didn't include it. But he said, we did some on farm, because Johnson, you said you got to do it on farm. It's not real if it's not on farm. And we did some on our research station. And guess what? On the research station, just like you predicted, there is no response. Because there's so much residual nitrogen in our research stations that they don't mirror farmers' fields. We got protein, but not yield. When we looked at the farmers' fields that aren't managed like a research station, suddenly we got different results. So I haven't seen the data, but it sounds like it could be pretty exciting. We did everything in farmers' fields because I want to make sure it's real. And we set up commercial sprayers so that they would, sometimes we didn't quite make it. But we did everything with commercial sprayers. It looked like this. The other thing, though, that we did, because you can see in this that there's incredible amount of treatments there, and you can't do all that small plot stuff. A farmer can't do that. But I'm a big believer in everyone in this room that now has RTK and a yield monitor. You are all now researchers. You can do your own research. And once you set it up on that tramline system, you can do everything. And so what we did was we took the 3 top treatments that we thought farmers would use, and we did them in fields. And farmers now are sending me data with 21 replications, because in the field they'll do every other strip, or they'll do 3 treatments and randomize, and they can send me that data, and it's incredibly powerful. So we did not only the small plot, we also did field scale. So here's the data set, the small plot data set. It's kind of intriguing. I look at that data set, and Jim Orson was right, because when I look at the response to fungicides, all I do is look at the response to fungicides, I get an 8 to 10% increase in yield from fungicides. And that's exactly what all my old data said. And by the way, when Ken put the data up yesterday, that's exactly what you guys were getting, was a 10% yield response to fungicides. Basically break even, who cares? And when I look at my nitrogen response going across the top, it's the exact same thing again. I'd learned that for years and years and years. What's interesting, what's really was my revelation, my big move forward, was start looking on the diagonal. And suddenly when you look on the diagonal, this synergy happens, and instead of break even, now I'm getting an 18 bushel per acre yield increase from the synergy between nitrogen and fungicides. And man, if that isn't exciting, then I shouldn't have come, because that is phenomenal. And that's on average. I mentioned genetics. When we did it on the best genetics, so that's our best genetics. Remember I talked about R47 was our next step up? Our best genetics, we got a 37 bushel per acre yield increase. We're pushing up in that range of a 33% yield increase. Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable from that synergy. The worst genetics, we broke even. So on the poor genetics, it still was okay, but it wasn't any big deal. But it really is that synergy that drives it. So what about the field scale? Because that's where the rubber hits the road, right? I went to the field with my farmers. The first year we had 20 sites. We got 21 bushels per acre yield increase. The second year we had 16 sites. We had 21 bushel per acre yield increase. My best cooperator, after 2 years of doing this, called me up and said, Peter, I'll work with you on any project you want, except this one. And I said, Don, Like what? We always do 3-year projects. You've got to do 3 years to know what the, he says, Peter, for 2 years, I have made $80 an acre more profit in these trials by using fungicides plus nitrogen. I'm sold, it's 100%. That's the way I'm doing it. And that told me a lot. In the 3rd year, we had 10 sites. We only picked up 18 bushels per acre. But you know, you follow this, and this is the problem you get into. So what's really intriguing to me is that when I do these nitrogen and fungicide trials, the bottom, the orange line is without fungicide. That's my nitrogen response curve. Without fungicide, the yellow line is with fungicide, and we've changed the slope of the curve. We've absolutely changed the slope of the curve. That is kind of exciting. Okay, so I'm almost done and I'm out of time. So fungicide timing, I get asked that question a lot, and we looked at that in an extensive way. And essentially here, I stole this slide from BASF. They took our data and put it pictorially quite nice. But the later you use a fungicide, the more yield increase you get. Why is that? What did I tell you about the importance of, keeping the crop going at maximum? When does it matter the most? Grain fill, absolutely. Well, Ken, what you're showing is that you can learn. You've actually learned something here today, right? Sorry. Actually, I gotta stop. I'm picking on you too much. By the way, I'm an equal opportunity prick. I will pick on anybody. So, the later we go, the more yield increase we get. What's interesting is that Marcia McMullen did some of this research in North Dakota, found the exact same thing. Everybody in my region wants to put a fungicide in at weed control timing because they're driving over the field anyway, and it's convenient. And it really doesn't do diddly squat for you. So you make the chemical company money, and they're happy. It's not a negative necessarily, but drive it later. That's where we get the big yield increase. Okay, so we're about here. We're over full, right? So tiller management, quickly. On tiller management, there's 2 ways. If you want to tiller manage, there's 2 ways. One is split nitrogen. The other is plant growth regulators. And one of the things that wasn't talked about yesterday, you're doing some great work on plant growth regulators, but the growth stage 3031, if you put the growth regulator on, chlormacot chloride, at 30, growth stage 30, you remove the apical dominance for about 5 days. And by removing apical dominance, you actually allow a few more tillers to establish. And if you want more tillers, in the UK, that's what they do. They create more tillers by removing that apical dominance. Be careful. It also affects stomatal closure so that the stomates stay open longer. And if you get more tillers and the stomates stay open longer, and you go under drought conditions during grain fill, you can actually reduce yield. So be a little bit careful from that standpoint. But these are the 2 ways that you would manage your tillers if you want to do that. Unfortunately, when I look at our data, and you can see here that I add 30 pounds of nitrogen, I pick up 5 bushels. I split my nitrogen, I pick up half a bushel. We struggle to gain yield when we split nitrogen. And I'm pretty much out of time. I think I'll skip through these. There is some interesting stuff there. But essentially with split nitrogen, it does help in terms of managing the weather. We get better weed control. You may not. The big one to me on split nitrogen, if you have lodging problems, split nitrogen reduces lodging. So if you go in with 2/3 of your nitrogen up front, now the wheat crop grows like it has that lower rate of nitrogen, and stem elongation is determined under low nitrogen regime, and it doesn't stretch. You come in at 1st to 2nd node, so growth stage 31 to growth stage 32, and put that last third of nitrogen on. Now it yields like it's got the full nitrogen, but it stands like you only put on 2/3 of the nitrogen because that stem elongation is already set. A little word of caution about that is if you come in with that last third of nitrogen and you don't get any rain to put it in where the plant can get it, that's bad news, right? So you guys are at some risk from that standpoint, more risk than we are, but that's absolutely true. You also get more uniform heading. You want to use a fusarium fungicide. You guys are starting to talk a little bit about fusarium. Split nitrogen will help even up the crop. You can do a better job with your fungicides. On the yield front, man, it's pretty tough for us to get more yield most of the time, which means we're about here. It's a near miss. So maximum wheat, the take-home messages, variety, variety, variety. And I'm ever so glad that you guys are moving into this new class of wheat where you can actually get wheat that has less quality but more yield potential. Because that's where you would use this program and have the most potential impact. You've got to have the genetic potential for yield or it doesn't work. Plant early. Look at the seeding rate by seeding date interaction. I didn't talk about seeding depth and weed control, phosphorus, but nitrogen by fungicide is really where it's at, right? That's really what drives this whole thing. So I hope a little bit of background in terms of why we think what we need to do is what we need to do. And with that, don't forget to watch out for things. And I'm done.